Good morning and welcome to Sunday School. Let's have a prayer together. Gracious and loving God, thank you for this beautiful day, a time to come together and to think about you, to read Scripture, and to find our story and your story. I pray that you bless us this day in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, thanks everybody. We're going to continue something that we started last week, which is looking at the Sea of Galilee. I did talk to my friend Edan. Some of you who may be new to this class, I have an Israeli archaeologist pal, and we talk, and he watches this he listens to the podcast and watches this video thing, and so we talk back and forth. And he told me that last week that I referred to the Sea of Galilee as a big lake, and it is a big lake. It's only 7 miles wide and 11 miles long. It has the same surface area as Lake Martin. But Edan pointed out that the word lake is not even in the Hebrew language until the 20th century. It's such a water-stressed part of the world that they only had the word sea. So, for instance, a bronze basin in front of the Temple of Solomon holding a vast amount of water would be called the Bronze Sea. It's the Sea of Galilee, not the Lake of Galilee, or the Lake of Gennesaret, if you will. It was only a sea. So in a place with not a lot of water, even something 7 miles wide and 11 miles long, it would be a sea to them. Let's talk a little bit about the Sea of Galilee some more, though. The first thing I want you to think about is that Galilee is really a region, not merely a lake. It's an area in the north of Israel. And I've drawn a map, hand-drawn a map, because I just couldn't find one that I really liked, that can show you a little bit about this region. We're going to work off this map today and also in our next Sunday school class when we go to a wedding at a place called Cana. But this is my attempt at a topo map. This is all a hilly region, pretty good-sized hills here in Lower Galilee, and then Upper Galilee, which runs up into southern Lebanon today. It's really mountainous, with Mount Hermon here, which is about 10,000 feet in height. I mean, it's a beautiful mountain. It's a real mountain. It's a real one, and they even have a ski resort there. When I took a group in May to Israel this year, there was still snow on the top of Mount Hermon, which is really remarkable that you could see from the distance. There's a beautiful valley that sort of begins this area called Galilee, called the Jezreel Valley, which is the breadbasket of their world. It's also the beginning of the Fertile Crescent, which is sort of a superhighway all the way into Syria, Damascus, that sort of thing, which historically had been a place of agriculture for that part of the world. The Sea of Galilee is here, and it sits in a deep, deep cut in the earth called the Jordan Rift Valley, which is part of the Great Rift Valley. It begins in Ethiopia and runs all the way into Syria, and it's where the two tectonic plates of Africa and Asia meet. So it's very seismic, a lot of earthquakes there, and so it's the Bible really doesn't tell you that Jesus lived in the lowest place on planet Earth. The Sea of Galilee is the lowest freshwater lake on planet Earth. It's about 800 feet below sea level, which means that it sits in a bowl, which means that the Sermon on the Mount is really the sermon on the bank of the lake. When you see it, it makes sense. There was a mystery between Matthew's Gospel and Luke's Gospel that, when I was in seminary, was addressed this way. Matthew's Gospel remembers the Sermon on the Mount. Luke's Gospel remembers the sermon on the plain or the level place. And so my professors would say, or they would conclude, what must have been two separate sermons. Luke remembered one and Matthew remembered the other, and perhaps that's true. However, when you go there, you see how the land works. It's level, 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 and then it drops off into the crack, right? It's both. It's both a level place and a mountain. So when you see it, the land itself can become a Bible, which is a little of what we'll do today. The land itself is a Bible. So another interesting thing about the Sea of Galilee is that it's an African lake, meaning it still sits on the tectonic plate that is Africa. But you go 1 hour and some change north, and you've got Europe on one side of the Jordan Rift Valley and Asia on the other side, which means that in this lake, pictured behind me and on my map, you've got African flora and fauna, African fish, bougainvillea, African climate. Very, very hot and humid in the summertime. Yet you go an hour and some change north and you've got brook trout and cherry trees. Fascinating, biodiverse place, all in a small, small area. The surface area of Israel today is about the size of Alabama. So what I want you to imagine is snow on Mount Hermon in Huntsville, the Sea of Galilee being in Birmingham, and then Mobile would be on the Gulf of Aqaba. And it's just crazy how you could have that many climates, that many continents, if you will, in such a small area. A word about the Sea of Galilee. You can always see across it. So it's not very big, and that's going to be very important to this story. We're told in Mark chapter 5, in the very first verse, that Jesus went to the other side, which is going to be really, really important, because this side of the lake, I don't have my pointer with me, but you can see this one. The eastern side of the lake is where Greek-speaking Gentile people lived. More than half the Gospels take place in a 10-mile arc on the northwest shore of the Sea of Galilee. Just so up in the corner, and you can see on the video piece here, Migdal, which is Magdala, around to Capernaum. You can see Capernaum at the top, and then you can see where the Jordan River comes into the top of Sea of Galilee and flows through it. Just on the other side of the Jordan River is Bethsaida, which was the home of Peter and Andrew, and where Jesus performed miracles there as well. Listen, more than half the Gospels takes place just right there. Very little takes place on the eastern shore of the lake because Jewish people didn't live there. Now, archaeologically, we know this because Gentile people had different habits, different food, different ways of construction. There is a city, if you can see on the video piece there, the little word that says En-Gev. That's where my friend Edon is from, En-Gev. Above En-Gev is a city on the ridge looking down over the Sea of Galilee. I'll show you a slide in just a minute, called Hippos, which means horse. It was a Greek-speaking trading city, one of the cities of the Decapolis, which you may remember from the Bible. It was a group of tradings, or independent Gentile trading places. The buildings there were plastered white. Our friend Stephanie here in Houston got to work on a dig in Hippos last summer, which is remarkable because I bet it was hot, 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 and dusty, 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 but fun, fun, fun. And so Edon's watching now, so he'd be thrilled you're in class. So Hippos would gleam white in the afternoons because the buildings were plastered. As the sun would set right in the west, there'd be an ambient light to shine on the eastern shore. And Jesus, preaching from a hill above Capernaum, would say, or the bank above Capernaum would say, a city on a hill can't be hid. They could see the city on a hill, not hidden, glowing, and that Jesus didn't just pull that idea out of the air. And so all the times you've heard that phrase now used in our own nation's history, a city on a hill can't be hid. We want to be a city on a hill. That's our aspiration, right, to be a city on a hill. Well, there was a city, and there was a hill, and it did glow. So that gives you a little bit of some color, if you will. Another thing I need to say about the Sea of Galilee, on the eastern shore of the lake, where the Greek-speaking Gentile neighbors would be, they avoided each other as much as they could. The Hebrews avoided the Gentiles, certainly, probably even more than the others, but they didn't like each other, and they avoided each other. But it was hard not to blend. The prophets would say again and again in the Old Testament, we want you to be different in the way that the Bible asks you to be different, which is to be differentiated, which is to be holy, which is to be undefiled. The Greek-speaking Gentile residents of the eastern shore of the lake were considered unclean because of the way they ate, perhaps, or they didn't keep the Sabbath. And so you know this archaeologically because on the eastern shore of the lake you can find pig bones, which is very important. You'll find none on the Hebrew side of the lake. But blending was inevitable. I mean, they lived together for centuries in this close-in area. And so, for instance, it became common amongst the people living in this region to ascribe all manners of maladies, sicknesses, mysterious ailments to demonic possession. It was common. And I want to say something about demonic possession for a second. I'll use this example. The Bible, if you'll notice, the Bible throughout history is very specific in the way that God acts. A good example is the example of Exodus. When God empowers Moses to go and speak on God's behalf before the king, and by the way, what I love to point this out about the Exodus. We can do all sorts of cartwheels and try to figure out who the Pharaoh is in Exodus, but see, Exodus doesn't care. He's simply the king. What the Exodus story wants you to know is this king is not good, and this king is not a god. Now, we learn God's name in the story of Exodus, but we don't care about the king's name. So Moses goes, because we all know the movie, right? And it's Yul Brynner. So Moses goes to Yul Brynner and performs all kinds of signs and wonders thanks to Cecil B. DeMille, right? Sticks turn into snakes, and the Nile turns into blood, and gnats, and all this magic happens. Okay, notice that God doesn't do this doesn't do this anywhere else. Because the Egyptians lived in a world of magic. The way that they approached their gods, their little g gods, was through incantations and through sorcery and through wonders. And so God used the way that they understood the divine, if you will, and met them on their own terms, met them where they are. Okay, just notice that you don't see God do that kind of stuff anywhere else in the Bible. It only happened in Egypt. In the Galilee, in the first century, they believed in demonic possession. Could that be epilepsy? Sure. Could that be some sort of cognitive disarray and a crazy mind? Of course it could. Could be anything, and it could be a demon, because they believed in that. And I will stop and say, I believe in the presence of evil. I've seen evil. I don't like to be near it, and sometimes you just brush up against something. We all do, if we're honest. It just seems wrong. But remember specificity. So I used Exodus as an example. I'll use this as an example. If I were to exorcise a demon in front of, say, Slims, okay, St. Luke's would be packed. The word would get around like that. I mean, it's like Rich exorcised a demon in front of Slims, and suddenly you couldn't shoehorn people into this church. I mean, it'd be amazing. A business would be great. You see, but the devil knows that too. So the devil would rather kill us in another way, and kill us slow, with anxiety, depression, despair. You see that God is always fighting a battle for us, and we are always given an opportunity to step into the light of God's grace and God's protection. But it's specific. What I want to tell you is that Jesus still saves, but saves us from this world. So it's tempting, right, to read these old stories and say, oh, these people are foolish or ignorant, or they did something different in their way. Actually, if you just walk around in the world a little bit, you start to see that their world looks like our world. So here's the drama of Mark chapter 5 that we're going to read today. In the chapter before, Mark 4, Jesus in a boat on the lake. By the way, since it's the lowest freshwater lake on planet Earth, and since it sits in a bowl, all kinds of storms get in there really fast. In the summertime, it has to do with the water temperature. You get a storm. In the wintertime, this wind blows in from the south and just rolls around. You could be on the water and boom, it's just like that. You're in big waves, capping kind of stuff. So they're in a storm, and the disciples are terrified. And these are water guys. They make their living on the water. They know boats. They know that they're in trouble. And Jesus says, "Peace, be still." What kind of man is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? That's Mark chapter 4. In Mark chapter 5, we see Jesus calm a new storm. Okay, here we go. Let's read it together. They came to the other side of the lake. Now you know what that means, right? That means they went from here to here. You can always see, that's important. They came to the other side of the lake, to the country of the Gerasenes. And when he had stepped out of the boat, immediately a man out of the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. He lived among the tombs, and no one could restrain him anymore, even with a chain, for he had often been restrained with shackles and chains. But the chains he wrenched apart, and the shackles he broke in pieces, and no one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always howling and bruising himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and bowed down before him and shouted at the top of his voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For he had said, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" He replied, "My name is Legion, for we're many." We'll take it aside just for a second. I will remind you that only the demons who inhabit a spirit world know the identity of Jesus at this point. His disciples think he's great, and everybody's following him around to see a miracle. But Jesus is the loneliest guy on planet Earth, because he can't let anyone know who he is, because if they find out that he's the Messiah, then they'll want to make him a general to run the Romans out of Judea, and that's not his mission. That's not what he's come to do. So only the demons know. All right, let's keep going. "My name is Legion, for we're many." He begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now on the hillside there was a great herd of swine that was feeding. Remember, swine are on the eastern shore of the lake, not on the Hebrew side of the lake. And the unclean spirits begged him, "Send us into the swine, let us enter them." So he gave them permission. And the unclean spirits came out and entered the swine and the herd, numbering about 2,000, and rushed down the steep bank into the lake and were drowned in the lake. That's the hillside. We'll talk about that in just a minute. This is a remarkable story. It's a scary story, actually. I mean, it's terrifying, frankly, and we can only imagine the terror that the disciples went right from the ocean now to some dude howling like a animal and bruising himself with stones. Luke's gospel said that he was from the city, which leads us to believe that it was the city Hippos that I mentioned to you, the city on a hill that can't be hid. This is the city wall of Hippos, and high atop well, I should say down below, rather, this high top city. So this city is up on the ridge. Can you see the lake behind it there in the corner? So that's the view of the Sea of Galilee. That's how high you are up there. About 1,000 feet above the surface of the lake. Down below, on the water's edge, or near the water's edge, are caves. And the caves are the tombs for the city of Hippos. Now, I need to say something about first century burial practices, because they don't make any sense unless you walk around in the world. The rocks in the Galilee and the rocks in the rest of Israel are very porous. Black rock around the Sea of Galilee, which is basalt, and yellow rock everywhere else, which is limestone. And it's very dry over there. It's very water stressed, which means that you've got caves everywhere from where ocean used to be, right, but back in prehistory. So any cave can be a tomb in their world. The one thing you don't want to do is you don't want to be left unburied. They were just terrified of being left unburied. So any cave could be a tomb. However, upon burial, burial places were very, very unclean. As a matter of fact, you would even be unclean for a while. You would have to quarantine, to use a phrase that we would all understand. You'd have to quarantine for a period of time, and only water would restore you. Washing of water would restore you to the community. So, this podcast is called Living Water. We're looking at water stories, really, and all these are water stories. This story happening on the lake, the role of water in purification. I mean, all these are about water, really seeing these stories in that way or in a new way. Anyway, so what they would do is they would put you in a cave as quickly as possible. Another thing that I like to do, and I'll do in a future podcast, is compare the funerary rites of the Egyptians with the funerary rites of the Hebrews, which is to say the Hebrews were very, very careful to say, we're not them. Remember, an Egyptian spends his whole life thinking about the afterlife and where you're going and what you're going to eat and what kind of boat you're going to ride and what jackal-headed God is going to meet you on the other side. The Hebrews would say none of that. They'd put you in a cave quick. And they would say in effect, that the earth is made for responsibility. Heavens are made for mystery. You just go to sleep with your ancestors. They didn't want to go there because the Egyptians would go there. They're not that. Are you going to be different in the way that the God asked you to be different? So you go to a cave right away. But that's only part one. Then a year later, they would come back and they would sweep your bones if it were before the exile, which is about 600 years before Jesus. Before the exile, they'd sweep your bones into a shaft, which means I was gathered unto my ancestors. That's what that means. After the exile, they began to gather bones into a little box called an ossuary, like a little coffin, because they began to understand themselves as individuals before God, especially after Ezekiel had a prophecy that I would blow on these dry bones and they'll live, right? So that's just a thumbnail sketch of how they would bury. At the bottom of this hill were the tombs for the city of Hippos. So you can imagine the terror now for first century Jewish guys. First of all, they don't belong on this side of the lake. They shouldn't be here. Secondly, they're unclean. I mean, they're unclean by association. This dude is unclean. They're in the middle of tombs. They're not supposed to be there. Thirdly, there are pigs around. They're not. This is wrong for Jesus and his friends all the way around. This story is a crazy, upside down story. And so he tells the man his name. My name is Legion. Well, who is this guy? Besides the fact that he has the Legion in his mind. Well, a clue can be found in the picture behind you. So you're not only looking at the city walls. Stephanie, do you remember what this is? Do you remember seeing it? I'm not going to put you on the spot. Okay, so you're not only looking at the city walls, you're also looking at a gymnasium. So this is the plastered floor of a gymnasium for security forces living and protecting the city. This was not a Roman city, but a Greek-speaking Gentile trading post. And so they used retired Roman legionnaires as security forces. So what would happen, a legionnaire, I've actually just read something about legionnaires. they would serve pretty much the entirety of their healthy young lives, maybe 25 years or so, until their knees gave out, right? And then they would retire. And if you were lucky, you would get a pension, which means a piece of land or somewhere to live. A little bit of the backstory of Paul's letter to the Philippians in the back of our Bible. One of my favorite Bible verses is "Rejoice in the Lord always." Again, I say rejoice. It's just Philippians chapter 4. It's so happy, and you put that on your refrigerator. But Philippi was a Roman legionnaires' pensioners' town. In other words, it was like a military base. It was like, think Columbus, Georgia. All right. And so for Paul to say, "Grace and peace to you from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ," grace and peace to you from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. Grace and peace were gifts of the emperor, not a man. And the Lord Jesus Christ, what are your loyalties? And so the Christians in Philippi were constantly harassed and beat up and thrown in jail, and so they were remarkably joyful in that brave way, joyful kind of community, and it's no wonder that the Philippians were probably Paul's favorite church. In this place, what you've got retired Roman legionnaires living in the wall of the city as a protective force. So these guys are now off the payroll of the emperor and now on the payroll of the city of Hippos. I have a friend who runs the park with the tombs in it down at the base. It's a lovely little park called Kersey. Did y'all go by there? Okay, yeah. Did you meet Nassim? Was he Nassim there? Clipping flowers. He's a lovely man. He's a Galilean Jewish person, and Nassim has a theory. And this is all theory. There's no way to know for sure, but I love this story. I love to tell it this way. Nassim believes that the man with the demons in his mind was a Roman soldier with PTSD. Now remember, all kinds of things were ascribed to demonic possession, but remember, he said, "My name is Legion." My name is Legion. So, hey, who could say for sure, but there you go. There were soldiers living in the walls. Perhaps it was a guy who had been a killing machine for so long that he could no longer live with himself, but perhaps he had just removed himself from the company of his comrades and lived alone at the bottom of the hill, and Jesus healed him. Jesus healed a hurt soldier. So now let's keep reading the story, because now we've got a little color, right? What my hope is that you're going to own this story, right, in a new way. Now you're just going to own it when you read it. You are there in their world. Let's keep going. So the swineherds ran off and told it in the city and in the country. People came to see what it was that had happened. It was a communal swineherd, probably, and so everybody's just lost their investment. And remember, they don't like each other. They don't like Hebrews on their side of the lake. And so this is a problem. They came to Jesus and saw the demoniac sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, the very man who had the legion, and they were afraid. And those who had seen what had happened to the demoniac and to the swine reported it. And they began to beg Jesus to leave their neighborhood. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed by demons begged him that he might go with him. But Jesus refused and said to him, "Go to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and what mercy he has shown you." And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone was amazed. That's the courtyard where he told his friends and his neighbors. This is the courtyard with the guy. Now I'm going to leave that up for a minute, and we're going to think about a contrast between the shores of the lake. Treat yourself sometime and read Mark's Gospel as a whole. It'll take 45 minutes. It's not a long, it reads like a good long short story, and it's great. And what you will see, you'll see things that you never saw before. So for instance, on the Hebrew side of the lake, which is the northwest shore, 10-mile arc, Jesus is a rock star. And nobody knows who he is for real, but he can't go anywhere. People, remember, they have to cut a hole in the roof to lower somebody down to see him. I mean, he's hounded by people day and night. And he feeds 5,000 people with a few crumbs and some fish. He preaches like no one's ever preached before. He says things no one's ever considered before. He takes on the authorities in a way that no one's ever done before. I mean, Jesus is a rock God, okay? They want some more of Jesus everywhere they go. On the eastern shore of the lake, nobody knows who he is, and they don't want him around. The eastern shore of the lake, he's a threat. First of all, he healed that scary guy that everybody talks about, right? I mean, everybody knew about the demoniac down in the tombs, and so that's frightening. And if that's not disorienting enough, the whole communal swineherd from Hippos now has plunged off of a cliff and into the sea, so they've had an economic loss. They want him gone. Then, Think about this. The demoniac, who's now healed and in his right mind, begs to go back with Jesus to this side of the lake so that he can become one of the disciples and help with the ministry. Heck, he's probably got more going on than the fishermen. He's probably, probably smarter than those guys anyway. And so Jesus does something remarkable. Think about the stories that you know on the Hebrew side of the lake. Jesus heals a blind man at Bethsaida, and he says, don't tell anyone. Right? What does the blind guy do? He goes and tells everybody. He'll heal a leper. Go show yourselves to the priest, but don't tell anybody. Of course, they all tell everybody. But Jesus says, don't tell anyone, because he knows that they have an incomplete understanding. They know about the miracle. They just don't understand that the miracle is a means to an end. Right? They know about the signs and wonders. They just don't consider that Jesus didn't come to become a general that could feed an army with bread and fish or raise a soldier from the dead. He didn't come to do that, right? And so he says, don't tell anybody. But did you notice here on the Gentile side of the lake, he says this to the man, I want you to stay here. Go. Tell your friends and your neighbors how much God has done for you. So, in this courtyard that you're looking at right here, this is where the man began to evangelize. Now, there's a little bit of a postscript to this story, and then we'll have time for questions this morning. A little bit of a postscript. Keep reading Mark's Gospel. This story is Mark chapter 5. But you keep reading. Jesus has some adventures, more adventures. He goes from different places. And then he returns to the eastern shore of the lake in Mark chapter 8. He returns to this side of the lake, and he feeds 4,000 people. Now, consider this for a minute. There are two feeding stories in Mark. He feeds 5,000 just north of Capernaum on the bank of the lake. He feeds 4,000 people on the eastern shore of the lake. Now, in Mark chapter 5, Jesus has one follower, one dude, the healed demoniac. 3 chapters later, he's feeding 4,000 people on the eastern shore of the lake. This man could sell. This is the greatest salesman the Bible never talks about. This soldier went and evangelized his world. This guy went and told everyone that what God had done for him, which should be an inspiration for us and a reminder for us not to hang on to what we have, but to share it with the world that needs it in our own way and in our own world. Remember the specificity of the Bible. If God made you a quiet person, God's not going to ask you to stand with a sandwich board on a corner. Okay, but God does give us the tools to share. Okay, God does give us the tools to meet the world's needs in our own way. And I think wisdom and faith is an eternal search for how can I share what God has done for me with someone who needs to hear that this stuff is real. Back to the park and Nissim. He's a neat fella. He is the caretaker of the park, which is unfortunately named. If Steph, you may remember this. The sign says the miracle of the pigs. And for that reason, a lot of people don't go because they think, miracle of the pigs. I'm in a motor coach and I've only got so much time in the Galilee. I think I'll go to Capernaum, not the miracle of the pigs, which is really sad because it just sort of sits over here by itself. Most people just kind of go back and forth in the Holy Ark, the 10-mile stretch. But I love this part, one, because it's quiet, and two, the miracle of the pigs is a little bit of a misnomer. It's really the miracle of a hurt soldier that got healed by Jesus. I want to see that, right? And so Nissim, and he's a very prayerful Galilean Jewish person, feels Jesus there. Now, I didn't say he says I've accepted Jesus or I believe in Jesus. I just feel Jesus. I feel his energy there. And Nissim will tell you, and there's a little bench under a tree, he'll say, I believe he healed him here. Isn't that remarkable? And so there are Galilean people today living on the Sea of Galilee. If they have a child, say, in the war, they will go and pray for their child on that bench. If they have trouble getting pregnant, they'll go pray for a baby on that bench. If they have cancer, they'll go pray for healing on that bench. There are people living in the Galilee today that feel Jesus' presence in this miracle, in this spot on the lake. And I don't know anything to say but to leave it there to say, I believe them. And friends, I think this story reminds me that God works in our world as well and will heal us if we take it. So Henry, I'm going to turn this off so we can take questions. Thank you for joining me for video Sunday School. Now you're safe. You can ask questions. Any questions at all? Anything? He really is kind of the eye in the sky. Last week I had a picture that was sideways. I said, well, if this picture were sideways, I could show you this, and suddenly it turned. I went, oh, he's watching. Somebody out there is watching, like the Truman Show. Any questions at all? Anything? Yeah.
So why do you think Jesus wanted this crazy guy to evangelize on his side of life?
Thank you. You know what? That's a great question. I really should have said it in the Sunday school class, so maybe I'll pick it up next week. He's safe to tell him what God did for him over here. The Gentiles aren't looking for a general to fight the Romans. They're not looking for the misuse of the Messiah, if you will. They don't know about God. So I think that's the reason, and that's the reason why it was so fruitful over there. But this guy's he's really the first missionary. Yeah. Any other questions? Sure, Anna.